Darkness enveloped the house for just a few seconds. Then slow, heavy footsteps echoed from deep within, climbing the stairs. Bluey grabbed Bingo's paw tightly and pushed the bedroom window, but it was locked. The footsteps stopped right at their door and an ominous silence fell. Then the door handle slowly turned. Bluey found the window key, but her hands were shaking so much that the key slipped and fell to the floor. The door opened, revealing Bandit and Chili standing completely motionless with empty, lifeless eyes. They looked at the girls but seemed not to see them at all. Bluey picked up the key and opened the window just as their zombie parents began moving toward them with slow mechanical movements. The sisters climbed onto the roof and descended via the drain pipe. Looking back, they saw two dark figures in the bedroom window, silently watching them from above. They ran to the neighboring house. Wendy's kitchen light was on, and when Bluey peered through the window, she saw Wendy standing motionless by the stove, not cooking, just staring at the wall with an empty gaze. Her husband sat at the table in the same unnatural pose, while their son stood in the corner with arms hanging like a doll's. All had the same empty eyes. Bluey stepped back and they ran down the street where every house glowed with windows containing motionless figures. The entire neighborhood was infected. At a streetlight, Bluey pulled out her phone. 1% battery remaining. People began emerging from houses, moving slowly toward the girls. "Where do we go?" Bingo whispered. Bluey remembered the abandoned house at the end of the street. They ran there. The door was open and inside it smelled of dust. Bluey found old candles and lit one. Soft light filled the room. "We're safe here," she whispered, but Bingo froze at the window. Outside, dozens of figures were gathering, neighbors and familiar faces standing around the house in silence, watching the windows and waiting. Something creaked in the darkness. Floorboards upstairs. "Who is it?" Bingo whispered. The house had been abandoned for years. Footsteps slowly descended the stairs as the candle flickered. A figure emerged from the corridor, an old man, the house's former owner. He had died last winter, yet stood there with empty eyes. His clothes were dirty and old, as if he'd been lying in the ground for a long time. Bluey realized the horrifying truth. The infection raised not only the living but the dead. The old man began moving toward them and the candle went out. Darkness. Bluey lit a new candle. The old man stood a meter away, reaching forward. She grabbed Bingo and ran to the back door, locked. The window was boarded up. They were trapped. The old man stood at the edge of the light as if afraid to enter the illuminated zone. Outside, the crowd waited silently. Bluey looked at the remaining candles. Only 2 left. "What happens in the morning?" Bingo whispered. Bluey didn't answer. She wasn't sure morning would come at all. The second candle flickered and something stirred in the darkness behind them. New figures were rising from the basement. To be continued. The morning began quietly. Mom was making breakfast. Bluey and Bingo played in their room. Dad stood by the window, unmoving. He didn't respond when Mom called him. He just stared outside. The street was silent, still. When Bluey peeked through the curtain, she saw their neighbor Wendy walking slowly down the road. Her steps were stiff, mechanical. Her eyes were open but empty. Behind her came more figures, moving the same way. Mom calmly lowered the blinds and locked the front door. She didn't explain, just said, "Stay inside." Dad sat in his chair, silent, unblinking. He didn't speak again. Bluey, unaware of what was happening, came up with a new game. Infection. In her game, one person becomes a zombie and tries to tag the others. Bingo hesitated. She didn't want to play. Bluey laughed and started creeping around the house with her arms outstretched. The game stopped when Dad stood up. His movement was sudden, unnatural. He turned toward them, no words, no expression. His footsteps were slow, heavy, and then he reached forward. Bluey and Bingo screamed and ran, slamming the door to the storage room behind them. Outside, footsteps, measured, repeating, no voice, no sound. They waited. Time passed. They couldn't tell how long. The air was heavy, still. Bluey found an old flashlight. She remembered a game where zombies were afraid of light. Together they opened the door and stepped out. The house was gray, quiet. Dad stood in the hallway with his back to them, motionless. Bluey turned on the flashlight. The beam hit his shoulders. He jerked. He blinked, then slowly turned around. There was confusion in his eyes. He whispered, "Where am I?" He didn't remember anything. He looked tired. That's when Mum came in. She stepped inside quietly, calmly. Her voice was soft, her face was neutral, but something in her eyes felt off. "Everything's okay," she said. "Let's go sit in the lounge." Dad didn't move, he just stared at her. From the window they could see more shapes moving down the street. Dozens, maybe more. Bingo took Mom's paw. Bluey looked at Dad. He was frozen in place. Silence, then a faint sound. A soft thump. The storage room door, the one they had just come from. It moved. The screen slowly fades to black. The last sound, a single careful step. Then nothing. The morning in the Healer household began as usual, filled with sunshine and laughter. Bluey and Bingo chased each other around the yard, while Bandit, their dad, sipped coffee on the veranda, watching them with a smile. Chili, their mum, joined him after finishing her morning tasks. Everything was perfect and familiar, but then an unusual parcel appeared on the porch. There was no return address, just a plain brown box as if hastily packed. Curiosity won out and Bandit opened it. Inside, to Bluey's utter delight, lay a brand new shiny figurine. It was a Labubu bright pink with its pointed ears and characteristic toothy bared grin. Bluey immediately snatched it up, hugged it close and named it Smiley. She was thrilled. Smiley instantly became her shadow. Wherever Bluey went, Labubu was there on walks, during games, even sleeping beside her on her pillow. Her joy was infectious and her parents saw nothing wrong with it. However, very soon inexplicable things began to happen in the house. First, it was minor disappearances. Bandit's favorite pen, Chili's hair clip, Bingo's toy block. No one could figure out where these items went. Then, Bluey began complaining about quiet whispers coming from her room at night. She'd whisper to her parents that Smiley was talking to her, but Bandit and Chili dismissed it as a child's vivid imagination. One night, Bandit woke up feeling thirsty. On his way to the kitchen, he heard a strange scratching sound coming from the living room. Pausing, he cautiously peered into the gloom. In the faint moonlight, he saw Smiley the Labubu sitting on the rug. Its head was turned as if looking directly at Bandit and its toothy grin seemed unnaturally wide. Bandit blinked and the figurine was motionless again, seemingly in the exact same spot. He convinced himself he was just tired. But the unease grew. Bluey's behavior began to change. She became withdrawn, often retreating to a corner of the room, whispering to Smiley. Her usual boisterous games took a back seat. Now she preferred to sit still, stroking the figurine. At times, her eyes would look strangely vacant and her smile somehow mechanical. The tension peaked when Bingo, wanting to play, tried to take Smiley. For the first time, Bluey reacted with unseen aggression. She growled, snatched Labubu away and clutched it tightly, a cold, inhuman rage flaring in her usually kind eyes. Bingo cried out in fright. Chili and Bandit were genuinely scared. They decided the toy was having a bad influence on their daughter. Later that night, while Bluey was fast asleep, Bandit carefully took Labubu from her grasp. He intended to hide it away. The moment his fingers touched the plastic, he felt an icy coldness pierce his hand. And the figurine itself momentarily felt soft, like living flesh, pulsing beneath his touch. Labubu's grin seemed to widen even further, and its glass eyes briefly flashed with a dull red light. Bandit thought he heard a faint, mocking chuckle. Stunned and frightened, he dropped Labubu. The figurine hit the floor with a dull thud, but then to his horror it slowly swayed and stood upright. Its eyes were fixed directly on Bandit, and its smile, it was no longer just a smile. It was the grimace of a predator. Bandit, consumed by panic, snatched Labubu and without a second thought tossed it into the outdoor rubbish bin. He returned to the house, breathing heavily, and told Chili everything that had happened. They decided never to mention it to Bluey. The next morning, Bluey woke up. She immediately reached for the spot where Smiley should have been. When she realized it was gone, her face twisted not just with sadness but with something darker and more sinister. She slowly got up, walked to the window, and looked directly at the rubbish bin where Bandit had thrown Labubu the night before. A slow, chilling smile spread across her face, almost an exact replica of Labubu's grin. And in her eyes there was that same cold, inhuman glint. From that day on, Bluey was never quite the same. Sometimes when she plays, her gaze becomes empty, and her laughter sounds too sharp, almost alien. And if you look very closely into the shadows of her room, you might just catch a faint pink glimmer and two glowing points, watching from the darkness. They are waiting. Bluey received a new antique doll. It was beautiful, with large glass eyes, but those eyes seemed too alive. The doll always faced Bluey, no matter where it was placed, even if Bluey turned away or moved to another room. At first, it was amusing. Bluey would laugh trying to catch the doll in the act, but it invariably stared back at her. However, Bluey then started noticing her other toys disappearing or breaking whenever the doll was near. Her favorite plush dinosaur ended up with a torn leg, and several building blocks simply vanished. At night, when everyone was asleep, Bluey would wake up. She heard soft, cautious footsteps from the living room. Then she would see a shadow gliding across the floor, though the doll was supposed to be on a shelf in its box. Bluey would pretend to be asleep, but her heart pounded. Soon, the doll began leaving gifts. Terrifying, crudely made figures from twigs, fur, and something else Bluey couldn't identify. These figures always appeared near Bluey's bed. Mum and Dad saw nothing strange when Bluey showed them the broken toys or odd figures, attributing it all to kids' games or you must be clumsy. Their denial only deepened Bluey's loneliness. One morning, Bluey woke to find the doll sitting right by her bed. Its eyes were not merely glass, they were absolute bottomless black voids. The doll held one of Bluey's old torn plush toys, that very dinosaur. A slow, distorted, almost sinister smile appeared on its face, unnaturally stretching its porcelain cheeks. The doll slowly raised its thin arm and with terrifying precision pointed at sleeping Bingo in the adjacent bed. Bluey froze, daring not to breathe. The room grew intensely cold. The air around the doll seemed to freeze. A sound, a very faint, barely audible rustle, as if something unseen was moving around the doll, and then a crack, like something fragile breaking. Bluey heard Bingo quietly sigh in her sleep as if dreaming. The doll didn't move, but its black eyes were fixed on Bingo. In the morning, when Bluey finally forced herself to move, the doll was no longer by the bed. It stood on the shelf again in its box as if nothing had happened. But the dinosaur it had held that night was now missing a leg. It was torn off and gone. And Bingo woke up staring at the wall, her eyes slightly wide, and on her neck Bluey saw a faint red mark, like a messy bite. There's a Bluey episode almost no one remembers. Or maybe they choose not to. It's called The Girl Behind the Glass. Some say it aired once late at night and then disappeared forever. No records. Only rumors and those who still remember what they saw. It started like any normal day. Bluey and Bingo were playing inside their house. The weather was cloudy. Gray light filled the rooms. Everything looked a little washed out. Bingo suggested a new game. Let's play mirror match. She pointed to the large window facing the backyard. You copy me and I copy you. They both giggled and pressed their noses against the glass. At first it was innocent fun. They raised their arms, twirled around, made silly faces. The reflections followed just as they should, but then something shifted. Bluey raised her right arm. Bingo raised her left like a mirror would. But the Bingo in the window didn't move. It just stood still, frozen. Bluey laughed nervously, thinking it was part of the game. She waved again. The Bingo in the glass tilted its head, not copying, just different. The real Bingo tugged at Bluey's paw. I'm tired, let's play something else. She skipped away from the window. Bluey stayed, staring at the frozen reflection. Something about the eyes. They were too wide. The smile stretched just a little too much. That night things got worse. Bluey woke to tapping, soft rhythmic taps against the glass. She sat up in bed. The backyard window was across the room, barely visible in the moonlight. But she saw her, Bingo, standing outside, pressing her face against the glass. Only it wasn't Bingo. The real Bingo was asleep, tucked safely in bed. Bluey whispered, afraid to make a sound. The figure outside smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, it was stretched. Wrong. Slowly, it lifted its hand and tapped once more against the glass. In the morning, Bluey told her parents. They smiled nervously and said she must have had a bad dream. They pulled the curtains tighter, locked the windows. But every night Bluey heard it, the tapping. And every night if she dared to look, there she was, the other Bingo, moving on her own, scraping her hands down the glass, mouthing silent words Bluey couldn't understand. Sometimes she would press her palm flat against the window. Sometimes she would just stand and tilt her head, watching. The last night Bluey woke not to tapping but to breathing, slow, wet, heavy. The window was open, curtains fluttered against the cold air. Bluey didn't want to look, but something inside her did. She turned her head ever so slowly. And there, sitting at the end of her bed, was Bingo, or what looked like Bingo. The real Bingo slept soundly, back turned to the horror. The thing at the end of the bed smiled, and in the softest, sweetest voice it whispered, "Your turn to follow me now." The screen faded to black. No ending scene, no music, no laughter, just the long, soft sound of something dragging across glass. Then, silence.